everybody. So this is my video about how to plant your container-friendly varieties of tomatoes. I'm using mainly 5-gallon buckets. For the micro orange hat, you'll see I'll use something a little bit smaller. This is for anybody and everybody that is stopping by this channel, of course, but most specifically this video is coming about in this time and place because I am growing some starts for the people in my neighborhood where I live. You might recall, if you've watched some of my other videos, that I mentioned a lot of people around me are not able to put in gardens in the ground. We either have no ground to speak of, or because of HOA rules, we can't be digging things up and putting in a vegetable garden. Or, you know, there's a lot of young families in my neighborhood and maybe they don't have the time for a full garden, so I can certainly understand that. And many people that are more towards the older side of things have all kinds of struggles with anything that requires a lot of digging or heavy lifting. And anytime, there's so many circumstances in which container planting makes gardening and some of the nutritional and emotional benefits of gardening available to people who might not otherwise be able to enjoy it. So I think even in the world of perfect, where I have the raised bed garden that I want and the cottage garden that I want and the big no-dig garden that I want, I think there will always be a place for container gardening because of how accessible it makes everything. So I wasn't able to film this in the way I really wanted to because I don't have a lapel mic or anything, and the wind was really loud. So we're just going to, as I'm going through my footage, I will give you the information that I would have liked to have given you while I was filming. So the variety of tomato that I chose to put in my very first bucket of the year is a Principi Borghese. I'm sure that I am not saying that right, but it's a new variety to me. I've never grown it before. It's sort of between the size of a cherry tomato and a Roma tomato. It's an Italian variety that is supposed to be very container friendly. You can see I'm using a 5-gallon bucket, and you want to make sure that you drill holes because you need airflow and drainage for the bottom of your plant. If you don't drill the holes, what'll happen is the first time it rains, it'll flood your pot out and your plant will just sit in lots of water, and that can cause root rot and fungus and bug problems in a way that's really not what you want to see. So in this bucket that I'm dumping out, you can see all of this yuck. This may not be for everybody, and if you're not interested in doing a worm bucket or anything to complement your soil situation, I'll put up right here somewhere on the screen the time that you can skip to, so you don't have to watch this part. It's not relevant and it may ick a lot of people out. But this pile of goo is basically just stuff out of my worm bucket. I have a handful of worms that I've brought home from the garden, and I throw food scraps in there to feed them, and there's all kinds of things that you can talk about in terms of vermiculture, which is worm farms. I don't have a proper worm farm set up. That's something I do want to do eventually. This is just a bucket that I just try to be very careful about how I layer things in with the worms. And when it rains, I try to make sure that any that got washed out the holes in the bottom get rescued before they die. But I take this bucket apart once in a blue moon. You don't want to disturb them too often. And I will pull it apart, and the parts, a lot of what was in here was grass, leaves, food scraps, and now you can see it's a good dark worm casting. It's worm poop, basically. You can see that long pause that I had while I was talking there. It was because I had to stop and chase a worm. You wouldn't believe how far he got as I was trying to wrangle him. But we put him back in with the pile here. We'll take some of these castings, and as I am putting in my potting mix and a little bit of like dead leaves, dead grass, In the bottom of my bucket, I will also be layering in these worm castings, and that has a great nutritional value for your plants. In container planting, because your plant is not in the ground with full access to all of the nutrients and the soil in the ground, it is particularly important that you pay attention to what you are putting in your pot. And I kind of wish that I had mentioned this part before I sent people not interested in worms ahead, but if you're just opening a brand new bag of potting mix and putting it in your bucket, that is totally fine. You will be good for the first year. You shouldn't have to worry too much about feeding. But once you have used it a single time, you want to start amending it with either a good quality fertilizer or I do a little bit of fertilizer, but then I use things like eggshell powder, which you can check out. My channel has a video that I recently put up about how I handle that. Or you can make bone meal by grinding up your chicken bones the same way, roasting them in the oven and blending them up if you have a powerful enough blender. Is another good thing. The worm castings, if I use whole food scraps, like you can see me using here, there was a piece of butternut squash and things like that that were not very broken down because I literally just put them out there a couple days ago. I filled the bucket about, what was that, maybe a quarter full with that kind of detritus. So over the course of the season, that stuff will break down in the bottom of that bucket and slowly become available to the plant in terms of nutrients. And whatever doesn't break down this season, when I reset my buckets for the following season, it'll break down further and further each time. So it continues to be useful. Oh, and I was saying, if you use food scraps that are not at all broken down, like that piece of butternut squash, make sure they're close to the bottom of the bucket because they will break down a little bit better. And you also don't want it close enough to the top that potentially pests or animals could smell it and go digging through your buckets and throwing your plants out. It can happen. I've never had it happen. I have heard people tell horror stories. So far I've been fortunate and careful and it hasn't happened to me. You can see I'm sorting through as I'm grabbing handfuls of the stuff out of the worm buckets. I am being mindful as I'm going through it not to be grabbing the worms as well. If you have lots of worms in your bucket, it may not be a bad thing to offload a few into your containers. They're good for your plants. They don't cause any problems. But I don't have very many worms in this bucket, so I wanted to make sure and keep all of the ones that I have intact in that environment so that they can continue doing the work for me. They're not freeloaders. I feed them and they do an important job. I started doing the YouTube channel because I had friends and family on Facebook that enjoyed seeing what I was up to. This is the fertilizer that I am using. I have not done a ton of research on fertilizer. I prefer to keep to organic stuff when I can, but we are doing this on a budget, so Expert Gardener brand has worked fine for me so far. And you can see I just kind of spread those pellets through the soil. Sometimes I'll do 2 layers separated by about 6 inches of soil. Those larger pellets in that bigger bag I like because they are easier to use. They don't blow away as a powder does. If, like, on a day like today I was filming and it was really windy. And they are a little bit more slow release, which I think is more useful in terms of just how plants function. So I did like the layer of the food scraps and the grass clippings and things like that, and then I did a layer of container mix and potting soil mixed together. You can just use potting soil, you can just use container mix, and I layered in a little bit of those plant pellets. And then you can see I made a deep well in the middle of the bucket. You want to get your plant as close to the middle of the bucket as possible Some people will try to stuff multiple plants in a bucket, and with some things you can do this. Tomatoes and peppers, you might be able to do it with 2 pepper plants because they like holding hands. They like to be close together, so you can sort of get away with it sometimes. I wouldn't say that's applicable to all peppers. You might have some trial and error. But with tomatoes, you really need 1 plant to a 5-gallon container because they have a lot of roots. They are heavy feeders. They're a little bit demanding. They need their own room. If you shove 2 in a single 5-gallon container, they might grow, but they probably will not thrive. You will not get as good a fruit. You will not probably get as much fruit as you would otherwise get. I have another video that probably will come out shortly after this one where you'll see I did put 3 cherry tomato plants in 1 grow bag, but that was a 30-gallon grow bag, and most of the other stuff that's planted in it has very shallow roots. So you can see I'm deepening the well to make sure. With tomatoes, you want to plant them really deep. I dug that down so that it was about 2 inches above my wrist. And then I went through and I pinched off some of the lower leaves. When you bury a tomato deep, you just cover that whole length of stem, and it will continue to put out new roots all along that stem. And the more stem you have under that soil, the stronger your root base is going to be, so that when you get a windy day or a storm blows through, it doesn't just totally wipe out your plant. It essentially has a real deep footing to hang on to. I put a few extra little plant food bits in the very bottom there, just under the roots. You don't have to. The mood struck me. Those roots will reach out into the soil fairly quickly and find the other plant food that you put in there. And then I top dressed with a little more of my worm castings and broken down food scraps. Really well broken down. These are like a full season sitting outside in the heat, in the cold, in the rain, so that those thawing and freezing processes could help it break down. That pile looks gooey and dirty and gross with the worms and the food scraps and everything. But the way that I know that it's working as it should is, 1, it's a real good, dark, deep, rich worm casting soil that I'm digging through. And 2, it does not smell. If you're doing compost, if you're doing vermiculture with worms, if you have bad, trashy smells because of the food scraps, it means your balance is off and something is not right. And you're getting anaerobic bacterial activities, which means not enough oxygen, and things are not as they should be. That's a rabbit hole that you can jump down and do lots and lots of research on. It's very interesting if you are into that kind of thing. At this point, you could mulch the top with a little bit of wood chips. In a container like this, anything smaller than a 30-gallon bag, personally, I wouldn't recommend wood chips in the top. I would recommend something that breaks down a little faster. I'm using some of my powdered eggshell just because I just ground up a bunch of eggshells and that's what I have on hand. And it helps prevent some of the bug problems that you might see. Slugs and things don't like to crawl across even powdered eggshell. It's uncomfortable for them. You can use leaves, broken up leaves, grass clippings, or straw, or like the shaved pine pet bedding works really well. A lot of people use that, and that will help keep your containers from drying out too quickly. It will protect your soil temperature when it gets really hot outside. Mulching is just a really, really, really useful thing to do, both in an in-ground garden and in your containers. Now, you might be able to get away with some of these varieties that I am distributing in the neighborhood. I grew them specifically because they are container friendly. You may be able to get away with no support. Keep an eye on it. If it seems like it's needing something to lean on, you could put a stake down the middle and just tie it up. Or I use tomato cages. I I don't know that this one will need it. If it turns out that it doesn't need it later, I may take it out and use that cage somewhere else. But since I had it, I went ahead and put it in there. Alright, so the next up is the micro orange hat tomato. This is a container, like probably the most container friendly variety of tomato that I have ever seen. Supposedly it does just fine in an 8 to 10 inch pot. I'm not 100% sure how big this pot is. It's one that I had from another plant that I bought a year or two ago. But it seemed like a good size. You could probably get away with just a little bit smaller than this, but I'm gonna give it some extra room and see what it does. If you're doing food scraps in your pots, littler pots, you wanna be really careful, not do a lot of it. I did mostly the grass clippings in the bottom of this, some banana peels, stuff that breaks down really quickly. The cucumber that you saw me pick up, if I have those, I don't tend to put those in my containers until they are pretty well totally broken down, because they do have seeds in them and they could potentially sprout. If they do, it's not a big deal. You can just pull them out or clip them off when they come up in the pot, but for the sake of saving it to use later once it's totally broken down, I usually leave those in my bucket. So this is a container soil as opposed to like a potting mix that I'm putting in it. The difference is potting mix is fluffier and softer. Container mix is a little bit, it does usually retain moisture just a little bit better, but it sometimes has bigger hunks of wood and stuff in it, so I don't use it a lot. If I'm working in any smaller than this pot, I would just use the potting mix. But in a pot this size, I felt okay doing like the bottom 1/2 to 2/3 in container mix. And then I did a layer of the plant food. You don't want to overdo it. This much is how you want. It is really easy to overdo fertilizer and it will burn your plants, even if it's organic. Too much of a good thing is still too much of a good thing. I probably under fertilize, honestly, but I would rather err on the side of caution. I think my plants do just fine with the smaller amount, and I would rather not risk burning my plants for all of the time and the energy that I put into, because I start most of my stuff from seed. It would be really unfortunate if I lost a whole bunch of stuff when I did a round of fertilizing because I got too happy with it. That's a mistake a lot of new gardeners make. They think, oh, this is really good. I'm feeding my plant. It's gonna do better. I should give it more and it'll do even better. And unfortunately, that's just not how it works with any kind of fertilizer. All right, so I made my well in the middle. This is a smaller tomato, and honestly, when I pulled it out of the pot and looked at it, the roots were still really, really loose, so this could have comfortably stayed in this little pot for probably another month, just because it's such a small variety, maybe 2 to 3 weeks. So he's loose in there. I just kind of let the loose soil fall away and situated it in the middle of the well and just carefully scooped the potting mix in around it. And you pat it down just enough that it's not gonna like collapse and settle down in the pot when you water, but you don't pack it down hard. You still want those roots to be able to get through pretty loose soil. And then you can see I am top dressing with a little bit of a softer, fluffier potting mix. You want to get your soil right up to where the bottom leaves are on a tomato. Later you might take those bottom leaves carefully off once it's gotten taller. And then I went ahead and, just like with the other one, I top dressed with a little bit of my powdered eggshells. And those will just break down over time. And calcium, there's a lot of debate as to whether calcium supplementation like this helps with something called blossom end rot. If I can find a picture, I'll put a picture up on screen. Blossom end rot is where your tomatoes are growing beautifully, and then when they're almost done growing, at the very bottom of the fruit, it starts to go soft and mushy and rots. basically where the flower was of the tomato when it was first started forming. So I am inclined to believe personally that inconsistent watering, letting it dry out too often and then flooding it with water and then letting it dry out again way too much, I think that has more to do with it. Everybody's sort of got their own opinion. It's actually this huge argument that a lot of people are very firmly entrenched in their camp, but the calcium does probably help with that a little bit. So that's my video on planting your container-friendly varieties of tomatoes. I hope that you enjoyed it. I hope that it was helpful to you. If there's anything I skipped over, any questions you have, feel free to put those down in the comments. I would love to talk to you about it. I can talk plants all day long. That's why I decided to put this channel together. For my friends and neighbors here that will be receiving plants very soon, I hope that you get a lot out of them. I hope they grow beautifully for you. I've enjoyed starting them for you. Maybe next year we can get you twice as many and you can have a whole patio full of plants just like me. Tomatoes are a lot of fun, and they're something most people can enjoy in some fashion or other. Fresh on a salad, saute them up and blend them into a tomato soup, cut them up and make salsa. Summer tomatoes are the best thing ever, and I'm so glad that I can help some other people enjoy them the way that I do. So thanks for stopping by the Caitlin Things channel, and I will see you guys in the next video.